Hey cats, it's Ed, Midsole Bud here. Today I'm talking about the mystery of the missing next percent. Bit of a Shoe Files discussion episode for you. Let's get straight into it. I remember back around the launch of the Vaporfly Next Percent, everybody was asking the question as to whether the Next Percent wasn't quite 1% better than the 4% that came before it. I think there were even pairs of the Vaporfly Next Percent that had 5% printed on the tongue, yet those never surfaced, and perhaps the actual perceived efficiency increase wasn't quite 5%. As such, we ended up with the Vaporfly Next Percent, the next version of the Vaporfly, and that seemingly applied to the ALPHAFLY Next Percent 2 as well. They carried on with that whole Next Percent moniker. Have you noticed though recently, as some other viewers have noticed, that Nike have slowly moved away from this whole Next Percent thing? That part of the naming convention seems to be part of history now, at least for Nike anyway. The original ALPHAFLY here, these were certainly referred to as the ALPHAFLY Next Percent. They did the same here with the ALPHAFLY Next Percent 2. I have made some modifications to this one, I will talk about that in a future video, but the new versions of the Vaporfly and the ALPHAFLY don't feature that Next Percent naming convention. So are they really that much better in terms of performance than the previous versions? Or have we reached a ceiling now where there are no more perceived improvements? I absolutely loved running in this shoe when I picked it up back in, I think it was like April of 2020. A genuinely exciting and exhilarating ride out the box. The ALPHAFLY 2, perhaps not so much. It felt like they've changed up the formula here without adding any real sort of performance benefits, perhaps making the shoes a little less nimble and a little bit more clunky in the process. The new version of the ALPHAFLY 3 does not feature that Next Percent name. Should we read anything into this? Or is it just like a small omission from their website? Let's go back to the Vaporfly actually and talk about the study that they used to actually come up with the whole 4% thing. Back in the day, Nike had a hand in an academic study which featured 18 athletes, all whom could run under 31 minutes for the 10k distance. During the study, I think the athletes used 3 different shoes. One was the Adios Boost 2 from Adidas, the other the Nike Streak 6, and then a prototype version of the Vaporfly shoe. It wasn't the one that we finally got on release to the public. Before I get into any more stats there, how many of you actually know anyone that can run a sub 31 minute 10k? Because I don't know very many people that can do that at all. So a lot of these stats here that Nike produced were very much for elite athletes at the time. All runners saw an improvement when using the Vaporfly shoes over the others, and that was anything between 1.59% and 6.26%. So some top athletes there, getting some positive but very mixed improvements there in single digits. I think if we fast forward to 2024, there's so many other shoes out there that now use very similar designs. Some of them are absolutely brilliant out the box but dull very quickly. Other shoes flex and improve over time. I would suggest these shoes that they used in the test were probably brand new, and certainly if you're comparing ZOOMX in the Vaporfly to Boost in the Adidas shoe, well, there was certainly going to be an improvement. Energy return levels of the shoes there, 66 for the Adios Boost 2, 76 for the Streak 6, and 87 apparently for that Vaporfly shoe. I think you better off call that energy loss because no shoe returns more. So a 10k test there, clearly a small advantage really, but enough to actually name the Vaporfly 4% after the actual test results. Certainly a better name than the Vaporfly, around 4% improvement for sub 31 minute athletes over 10k against the Streak 6 and Adios Boost 2. That just isn't a very easy to remember name, is it? Joking aside, is the ALPHAFLY 3 any better than the ones that have come before it in terms of energy return? One thing I have noticed, the ALPHAFLY midsole heel to toe drop seems to perplex pretty much all reviewers. We've seen people cutting the shoes in half and measuring them. I've measured all my pairs and they all seem very slightly different. A lot of reviewers just choose to use Nike supplied statistics, and They don't really seem to add up. I think the drop of the Alphafly shoe is certainly lower than Nike are trying to tell you it is. Run Repeat mentioned that in their review of the Alphafly 2 that it's not an 8mm drop at all. There's a 4.7mm drop. They had 38.6mm in the heel, 33.9mm in the forefoot. That is quite different from Nike's claim really, and it certainly is more in line with what I've felt about the Alphafly shoes so far. I actually think you almost get like a negative drop really in the Alphafly. The squashy foam in the heel is quite vast, and those AirPods at the front, which are very responsive, but yeah, they don't squash down anywhere near as much, perhaps even making the shoe a bit sort of front heavy, I suppose. Now, here's a bit of food for thought about all of this. You know, I always try to provide some balance to the argument. I'm not just saying
Vaporfly bad, Alphafly bad.
I'm just trying to put all the information there and you can draw your conclusions. October the 15th, 2015, Runner's World article here. Nothing I've seen has a positive return of energy, says Chris Brewer, running category director for Adidas. We're not going to claim that shoes with Everrun will reduce your cost of running, says Spencer White, Vice President of Saucony's Human Performance and Innovation Lab. Puma make it clear that the more in its more energy out is comparative. They mean more than from other foams, not more total energy out that goes in. I think they were really discussing the Adios Boost technology way back then in 2015. I think all the foams then were sort of heading for a 70% energy return rate or 30% energy loss, whatever you want to call it. Foams now certainly a lot softer, and they're all heading for sort of like the 80s perhaps. Or perhaps is it the foam's ability to keep you from getting injured with more consistent training minus some of the impact. One last thing on the Alphafly, I've always viewed that as a marathon orientated shoe with the increased heel width to aid in stability. Definitely the same can't be said about the Vaporfly. I think Nike have got a bit of an issue right now where they've got two shoes that people do seem to enjoy, but from everything I've heard, the Alphafly does now seem to be very much the marathon shoe. I think Nike trying to position the Vaporfly as perhaps something you can run any kind of race in. It's certainly a bit more narrow and refined back there in the heel than the previous versions. And no matter what anybody tells me about that Vaporfly shoe, it does seem to sit back a bit further into the heel this time, almost like it doesn't quite perhaps hit that 40mm limit. I think they are trying to remove some of that mass in the heel to try and almost entice you to land mid to forefoot in the Vaporfly 3. A big thing that people seem to be missing about the Alphafly 3 direct from Nike is that they seem to be using a different process to manufacture the ZOOMX this time round. Everything here points towards it perhaps being closer to the original Vaporfly 4, and no one can tell me that the foam in that shoe is the same as we've had in some of the Vaporfly Next % releases over the last few years. Definitely feels a little bit different. It felt very brittle and kind of almost weightless, I suppose, in the first Vaporfly models. They've been obsessing over the quality and compression ratio of that preform to final part. It's one of the ways that they've increased the softness and comfortable feeling and reduced the weight. Now, a few viewers have got hold of me and have managed to get pairs of the Alphafly 3. They've been testing them out and they've perhaps found that the energy return there isn't quite perhaps exactly the same as the Alphafly 2. Feel it's perhaps not quite as sort of propulsive and squashy, but the lightness of the shoe does seem to make up for that a little bit, perhaps down to the altered manufacture of the foam and those new upper materials. So not saying it's a bad shoe, they're just trying to say that actually it's a lot lighter than the previous version, and that could actually address the balance. Although Nike have removed the next % section from the Vaporfly 3 and the Alphafly 3, lots of other retailers are continuing to use that on their websites. In fact, there's even some very small pairs of the women's version of the Alphafly 3 still available, perhaps not as lucrative for resellers to pick up and try and sell on to other people. So is that whole next % thing a little bit old hat now, if Nike decided to just push it to the side? I think the original was there to show that it was, you know, slightly better than the Vaporfly 4% to entice you to buy the shoe, but in the current landscape I just don't really feel that that's a selling point anymore. There's lots of other shoes that are just as good now, if not better. Have you got the Alphafly 3? Do you reckon that it's still worthy of the next % name, or do you think it was just a load of marketing jargon? Let me know your thoughts and opinions on this one down in the comments. I've got a fantastic musical interlude for you today. I've been listening to a lot of material by producer Joe Meek. That guy was around in the 1960s, produced some amazing stuff. Very English sounding sort of material. Some quite frankly bizarre recordings. There's a few singles by Screaming Lord Sutch, who I believe went on to sort of stand for election a few times here in the UK. My favourite though is by the Honeycombs, and it's called Have I the Right. This is a real stomper, this one. It kind of sounds like a load of people have been let loose on a small tape recorder and they've managed to cram as many instruments into a room as possible, and they're just sort of like beating the hell out of them. It's just a cacophony of noise, but it truly is fantastic. You couldn't make it sound any more English really if you wanted to. Everything's distorted, there's lots of echo on stuff, but the chorus which comes in, it just lifts the whole song up, and there's nothing quite like it really. The lyrics are about a chap who's telling his loved one to, you know, come back, he's going to prove, you know, how much he loves them. I can only imagine what people thought of this when it came on the radio back in the 60s. People must have been a little bit afraid, I suppose, because there's just such an exciting sound there coming out the speakers. Joe Meek, sadly, gone too soon. If they'd only sorted out all the licensing palaver for the royalties for Telstar, we'd probably still be around today. Go and check it out, people. The Honeycombs, produced by Joe Meek. Have I the Right. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Help the channel to continue to grow by picking up a bit of merchandise. Give this video a thumbs up, like too. It really does help. My name's Eddbud, and I'll be seeing you